Thanks for tuning in. Today's podcast is brought to you by SmartBridge. In a world of ever-expanding data, it's tough to generate insights at the speed of business. SmartBridge delivers modern business analytic architectures with cloud-based computing platforms. Our technical expertise and partnerships make sense of big data without big headaches. SmartBridge is a Houston-based company with over 15 years of experience in numerous industries. More information at smartbridge.com.
Hey guys, welcome to today's episode of Transform IT. Today we have a special guest from Inspirus, Chris Preston. He's the Chief Strategy Officer, and we're excited to have him here today. This is Miraj Jiwani.
I'm Patrick Pauls.
Hey Chris, welcome to the studio. How are you doing?
Good. Hey, thanks guys for having me. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here. So, before we dive into the topic at hand today, can you give us a little background on your experience and how you ended up at Inspirus?
All right, so you guys are going to date me before, just right out of the gate, I
Yeah,
guess.
right away.
You look really old. Well, again, I'm glad this is a podcast and not a YouTube video.
Not
yet. Well, I've been in this space for over 30 years. I actually started my career off with Eastman Kodak Company in the earliest days of imaging and workflow. This is before digital imaging. Actually,
wow.
I hate to say this, but it was dealing with microfilm. And I was able to witness the transition from that into digital imaging and even the entry point of OCR technology way back in that day. And actually, it was a great experience working there because I actually got exposed to a lot of different areas. In fact, I did everything from not only sales and product marketing, but also as a business re-engineering analyst, which employed a lot of these technologies that we're talking about and running into these same issues. And then from there, went on to work for FileNet, which is now part of IBM. We're in the business process management practice globally for several years, and then went on to EMC. Handling the same kind of class of products, again, global responsibility, leading that, which included things like case management, and in addition to imaging, workflow management, and customer communications, and as well as digital customer experience. Went on to have that same experience over where at Oracle, where I actually was part of the strategy group responsible for running the digital experience practice, which included not only web customer experience and engagement, but also included use cases like accounts payable and driving greater levels of automation for an organization. And that's actually was through that experience I got connected with Inspirus, and which is why I'm here.
That's wow. That sounds great. That's a pretty impressive resume so far, and I know you had to cut it down for our listeners.
LinkedIn. It's really awesome.
Yeah.
With that said,
Sure.
let's. We're here today to really talk about AP automation and a lot of the things surrounding it, the strategy specifically. But before we dive into the strategy, can you give us a little bit of a background of the traditional accounts payable process, some of the challenges, some of the evolution over the past 20 years, and just kind of set the stage for us to talk about the strategy and how people can move forward?
Sure, and as I said, kind of dating myself, it's actually even longer than 20 years. It's been out there quite some time, in fact, but it's through that experience that actually there's an interesting kind of insight, which is it's the old adage, the more things change, the more they remain the same. And it's something that I've just, is an insight that has developed over the years. And it's in the case in point, for example, let's just take a look at one of the number one challenges most organizations face today, still today, is the majority of invoices coming in are still coming in via paper or via email. In fact, email has become the new paper. Now, this is interesting because this is here today, despite the advent of EDI and e-invoicing technologies that have been around for decades. So they've been around for decades, heavily sold, heavily marketed, and yet here we are still today, and we're still experiencing this basic challenge. In fact, let's look at email. Electronic technology, right? You would think this would help the process, but what happens is, in some organizations, I'll receive an electronic invoice via email from a supplier, and what you'll see next is the people in that organization will print it out. They'll manually data enter it. They'll manually route it through approvals, and continue the rest of the processing in an analog fashion. Obviously, not ideal, right? And that would just, so there was just that one, piece of observation, or I would, we could all take a look at, right? I'm sure you guys have seen that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely. It's one of those things, again, coming from the technical side, you take a look at it and you say, okay, we implement these tools and these processes to actually help the people out, make something more efficient, and then people will go and do something crazy like print out an email so that it can go through a manual paper process. I mean, it never astounds me. It astounds me what people can do.
Yeah, and yet, it certainly happens. But that's also why technologies like imaging and OCR were developed, right? It was to way early on in the scheme of things to take care of the paper problem, right? But again, those are technologies, and data entry, I should point that out too. But these were technologies that were developed over, 3 decades ago. And yes, while image quality has improved, and yes, the data extraction accuracy has also improved, yet here we are, and this still is a challenging area because, as you know, OCR technology is not 100% accurate. It's not infallible. You still have to go through a verification step because there's a point where the engine is going to come back and say, on this particular invoice, I can't tell if this is a 6, an 8, or a B. I need a human to tell me what it is, or somebody drew a line through something. Certain things have gotten better, but those issues still persist. But that's not really where the struggle is. If you take a look at then, once I get that data from OCR and from the image, or I'm extracting that information off of an email attachment for that invoice, the basic model is I may run that through workflow, but I'm going to take all this data, then I'm going to push it up and upload it to the ERP system, which is really running and driving the process, or the business for that matter. That's where all the accounting functions are, right? And so this is where a really interesting statistic comes up, and it's something that has been consistent in all my travels and agency experience, and certainly currently working with customers today, is that about 8 out of 10 invoices will have at least one exception.
8 out of 10?
8 out of 10.
Wow, that's pretty high.
You're talking about OCR being 80% accurate, and then on the flip side, 80% of the total invoices that are created have issues there also. So that what you're saying is there's a lot of inaccuracy in the process.
Well, there's a couple things going on there. So, you'll hear vendors tout the 80 or 90% automation. They're just talking about the efficiencies gained from getting rid of the paper and a good portion of the data entry. But when these exceptions occur, there's a really interesting dynamic taking place. So the reasons for these exceptions are, for the most part, to a large degree, outside the domain control of the OCR environment. May have nothing to do with it. Because what's happening is, as I'm uploading that data from these OCR capture subsystems, is that the ERP system, let's say JD Edwards in this case, is interrogating the data coming in, saying, hey, does this information constitute valid and complete invoices? And this is where you get the exceptions. And this is what is one of the major challenges to organizations, and has persisted since the dawn of time around this. From the very beginning, it's always been about the exceptions. And so, by the way, these exceptions occur that are, again, outside the domain and control of OCR. So, for example, the information that the ERP system is looking for may not physically be on the invoice. Okay. So here's a couple of examples. Or, obviously, processes that has nothing to do with the OCR process, such as the PO has run out of funds. Everything to do with the ERP system, nothing to do with that the OCR system could have impacted. But then there's things like there's a failure in the line pairing. The price and quantity on the invoice falls outside the thresholds that you set in the ERP system. Or I have a PO-based invoice coming in that does not have the PO number on it. Those are all cause for exceptions. And there's about 80 other different examples of that. So it has everything to do with what the ERP system needs and expects. Because again, you could have had a 100% accurate read on the OCR side and still run into these issues.
That's right.
Which also points to a couple of other leading or corollary problems. One is this is also caused typically too by the lack of depth of integration to the ERP system. A lot of everybody defines integration differently. So Patrick, I'm sure you run into this all the time.
Oh, you talk about APIs, and that's at least it's been for the past couple of years the new thing. Let's make everything integrate with everything else. Let's make everything work with everything else. And while a lot of progress has been made, it's still one of those things that I think a lot of people talk about, and not many technologies really do particularly well.
Yeah, and that's actually, to your point, is what's defined the term integration, right? So integration, when somebody says, I'm just uploading information, I've handed it off to the ERP system, that's integration. And I would argue that's not integration, right? And integration should be real time. It should be bi-directional or two-way. And I should be able to leverage the data that exists in the ERP system as well as the business logic.
Yeah.
Because one of the major challenges in these systems, which is now I'm getting to another key problem, is the approach to invoice automation. Is that the vast majority of vendors, virtually all, do the same thing the same way, which, by the way, has persisted for years. Okay, and that model is, hey, I'm going to extract the data, I'm going to send it through workflow, and I'm going to bundle it all up, and I'm going to ship it up to the ERP system or upload it. And I'm going to let the ERP system deal with all these exceptions and the AP staff. Let them adjudicate it because I don't really know that system really well. That's outside my scope of the process, so let others deal with it. So now I've basically done this. I've passed the proverbial exceptions buck, up onto somebody else. I placed that burden, that labor burden and whatnot onto somebody else. Or again, I just use another little metaphor. I'm just kicking the can down the street. And so if you look at business, and this flies directly in the face and counter to best practice business transformation strategy, right?
Well, you also were talking about, okay, so you're taking this information into this other application, and they say the integration, but it's not two-way, like you mentioned, and also you have this local repository of information there. And so what you're basically doing is you're extracting information, you're cleaning it up, you're keeping a local repository, then you're uploading it, and it's a very inefficient process. I mean, you talked about some of these applications and solutions are able to come down and they're able to, mimic some of that workflow and do some checking and error correcting. But ultimately, when it comes back to it, you're not, instead of reusing what you already have, you're creating a second set to do that error checking and that validation, which is an exceptionally inefficient way to process these transactions.
Exactly right. So what you're talking about there is how do I address exceptions, right? So one model is I just pass it up and let the ERP system and the AP team deal with it, which again runs counter to best practice for business transformation, which you want to address all exceptions as early or as far upstream as you possibly can in the process, right? Versus pushing it down further and delaying addressing it in the process. And I'm sure you can relate.
You're just complicating the whole process, creating bottlenecks, and it becomes inefficient in terms of cost, time, effort.
Exactly why? Because when you push the problem downstream, because I actually had somebody challenge me on this one time and said, what does it matter if you do it upstream or downstream? It's downstream. It's the same thing. It's the same amount of time. And it's like, no, wait a minute, time out. It's not. And this is why business process improvement practitioners are trained early on with Six Sigma and other vehicles around you want to address all exceptions and issues as far upstream as you possibly can, because what happens when you don't?
Well, the issue becomes larger. The further down the road you kick it, the more people that touch it, the more processes have to go in place, the more data is corrupted or changed or, inaccurate. And the longer anything that, project management 101 is, okay, you identify and correct problems early on. Otherwise they get blown out of proportion. And it takes an amazing amount of resources to correct them.
Exactly. I mean, how often have you, in your own personal life, did you regret not taking care of something in the beginning and then
yesterday?
Yes, because all of a sudden, now my wife found out. Now I got to go fix that and whatnot. So they actually, to your point, Patrick, you collect more people, more complexity, more errors, and consequently more cost, right?
Yeah.
So now this gets into, again, you want to address all these things well in advance, and that's why exceptions continue to be one of the key problems that exist and persist in this environment, and that the ERP integration is so crucial to that to help alleviate that. And you brought up another key point, Patrick, which was, well, one means and vehicles for mitigating those exceptions is I'm going to then do it all in my system. Well, what does that entail? Well, you'll hear a lot of vendors say, I want to download your entire master file on a periodic basis, let's say on a nightly basis, so I can do my matching, do my exceptions or validation processing, whatnot. And that's not automation. I just created another risk factor by doing a lot of data synchronization. Typically there's more labor involved in making sure that all works right. But here's something else to consider. The business logic in the ERP system, now I have to try to mimic that in my separate siloed system. Definitely not
an
ideal.
easy task.
No. And What degree of fidelity do you think you get with that?
And then you add, okay, so
You don't.
you
You
have no
don't.
fidelity,
Zero, yeah.
and you add the additional. Okay, not only is it additional complexity, not only are you increasing your cost and your time duration, at the same time you're coming in and you're looking at that, and you're each an ERP is different in some way, shape, or form. Each business caters the ERP to its own logic. So going to what you said also is that, okay, even if you could mimic something that's out of the box for this ERP system, okay, so what happens when the client customizes it because they have a process that's not 100% out of the box? And then it looks like the vendors to adhere to this or to kind of throw that process in there, they don't know everything about it, and all it does is seem like it could introduce errors, time, cost, inefficiency, and it just does not sound like a good way to do business.
You're exactly right, and this is why organizations get really frustrated because they were, they were sold on the idea, as you hear a lot of vendors tout, 80 or 90% automation. First thing is they're not talking about the end-to-end process. They're typically talking about just that front-end part of the process because they said, hey, I don't deal with these exceptions. Or when they do, the organization is frustrated with the fact they're not getting that 80 or 90% automation. They're lucky if they're getting 20% automation because there's a lot of manual effort still tied up in managing, I should say, these exceptions, pure and simple. So the other, I would say, problem that has persisted over time is it's more on the solutioning side of things. So I mentioned first thing is that the majority of vendors still follow this, what we call this legacy approach, which is this upload or having to enforce downloads of information, much like we just described. But there's also, okay, what are the solutions that are available to address this problem? And it's like, what are the options? So this is the classic conundrum that has, plagued enterprise software, our customers' views of in working with enterprise software for years, which is you have the Uber platform approach, like similar to the P2P platforms that are available today, or the best-of-breed point solution approach. And then there's the in-between in this case of, I'm going to look to have this all embedded within my ERP system. And what's the best approach, which is the best choice? And when you go to look at because the Uber P2P platforms, you typically see that the scope goes well beyond the accounts payable target. And as a consequence of that, you could run into the situation of the mile-wide, inch-deep kind of scenario, or typically these platforms specifically major in one dimension of that platform because that's where the heritage came from. And the rest of the technologies were bolted on through acquisitions or other facets that are typically, at least in the AP space, doesn't fit the bill. It doesn't give enough functionality. Some argue like, well, I'm just trying to get a good enough there to get the checkbox. But the reality is AP, especially in the use cases today, are fairly complex and require a lot more functionality and capability to do that. Then on the other side of the dimension, you have the point solutions that only address one dimension of the accounts payable opportunity. So for example, it might just major on invoice capture and ingestion or dynamic discounting, but they don't address the total opportunity that exists
The
around
end-to-end cycle.
Exactly,
Yeah.
which gets into things like not only invoice automation but payment automation, discount management or dynamic discounting, and supplier enablement. Those are all crucial things that typically get missed. And then if you look at the scenario or the option of I'm just going to do an embedded approach, typically you're challenged by first of all tied to the requisite functionality that exists within an ERP platform. A lot of it is not specifically overly tuned around the use case and exceptions that we're talking about in processing. And so you need to add layers of technology to do that. Usually it's very high cost customization work. First seems simple, I got to, out of the box. And then to your point, Patrick, when you get into it,
Yeah, you realize, it's
exactly.
not an easy effort.
Exactly. And then what happens when you decide to change ERP strategies? If I'm so wedded to this one environment, and this, by the way, wasn't a real concern several years ago, but with the advent of cloud-first ERP systems, those are getting a lot of attention today. Because as organizations want to become more modern and they want to transform, they see this as one of the key vehicles to do this. And this is more than just simple lift and shift of ERPs to a cloud-based hosting environment. There is this continuous innovation and value that these cloud platforms also provide, but they're very thin on the capabilities here, but they evolve, right? But the question is, again, if I'm so wedded to that, if let's say I go from JD Edwards to Oracle's new ERP cloud, what do I do? I now have to basically let go of whatever I have built and do it all over again, right? Or what happens if I do a merger and acquisition?
You're looking at multiple ERPs, whether it's the same JD Edwards, or maybe a JD Edwards and SAP. Not to mention that is to go along with that logic or that problem set is, okay, what do you deal with a global company? Someone that may have 4 or 5 implementations of a specific ERP system running in different areas. So you have your Asian Pacific one, you have your European, you have your Americas, and how do you integrate all of those solutions and all of that ERP logic and data? How do you leverage all of that, and how do you get a solution that can go on top of that and basically be ubiquitous through all of that entire environment?
Exactly. I mean, how do I get to a shared service, which can drive real, or I should say huge benefits. And a lot of organizations, that's a key trend right now. But in that scenario that we just talked about, I have to create and stand up another AP automation platform. Let's say as I go to, let's say, JD Edwards, now I got SAP coming in the mix. I'm now standing up another environment if I follow that kind of solutions approach. So the real thing I'll take a look at is there something in the middle that allows me to have an automation platform that really combines the core key elements that AP needs, because AP has evolved to be more than just about efficiency and cost savings, right? There is, as we'll talk about, there's a real opportunity here to do much more, be much more aspirational and become really a profit center.
So let's talk about those opportunities. What are the keys to success around accounts payable and automation around that?
Right. Well, the first thing is it's certainly much more than just about OCR and workflow.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I would say that those are core technologies. They're commodity. They're certainly a fundamental requirement. It's much like what you would expect. You would expect office Wi-Fi or a network to be present. You would want to have those technologies.
You just have to have it.
Exactly. Just have to have it. But there's so much more to this equation, because as we talked about, the core or the keys to success is, first of all, I have to have a means and use of technology to drive out those exceptions, right? And there's 2 dimensions to exceptions. There's things that automation will definitely take care of and get rid of right out of the gate. And there's some things that we talked about are still going to be human-based processes. Like we said, if the PO runs out of funds, there's really no true way of, you can help do some automation around to make that process easier for the people that have to engage. So you provide the right controls and help streamline that process and make it easier for people to do that. So that's where automation can help. And again, key focus is how do I eliminate those exceptions? Because we pointed out, that's where the majority of the ultimate issues around manual effort, errors, cost, and time is coming from, right?
And if anyone ever finds a way to take that, the AP funds or the funds are empty, and automatically or with some AI generate those funds again in that account, please let us know, because I'd like to be involved in that process.
Yeah, we'll upgrade the studio, get on YouTube.
And a lot of
get
good
with
things.
Get with Kickstarter.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I would say the other things that I would say are the keys to automation success, as we talked about, is about the depth of integration with the ERP system. Yeah. So versus just the upload or downloads of data to help mimic certain things, is I want to leverage the data and the business logic that already exists. So that's the first level of effort or thing that I need to have is my core to success. And it should be with all ERP systems. I want the flexibility of having that insurance policy. So no matter how my ERP system strategy shall change, I make sure that my process around P doesn't have to change. It's abstracted from those types of changes. Also is if you go through mergers and acquisitions, or you live in an environment that has multiple ERP systems, I want to turn that into a shared service, or at least be able to service in a consistent fashion, embracing multiple ERP systems without forcing a consolidation of ERP systems or waiting for the rapture of ERP consolidation.
So it's
to
like
occur.
like you're saying, it's deep integration, but without being tied down to one or having to deal with the issues of bringing in multiple ERP systems together.
Well, I used to tell this joke, and I really do mean it. When you have multiple ERS systems and you try and migrate to one of them, you use the term rapture. And well, that may be a little intense. I will say it's probably easier to put a man on Mars than it is to migrate or to consolidate ERP systems right now, especially if you're doing something like going from SAP to JD Edwards or back and forth.
Well, it certainly would take less time
Yeah.
sending a man to Mars, at least from what we've seen, right? For sure. I would also say one of the keys to success is that you want to basically combine the core elements or optimize accounts payable around 4 key areas. One is around invoice automation. We're talking about how you accelerate the processing, limiting those exceptions that we talked about. But you also want to add payments automation to this mix as well, directly. So if you think about it, I just got the invoice approved for payment. What's the next thing you want to do?
Pay it.
Pay it, yeah.
It's a last mile, right?
Yeah.
And yet, here we are today, is viewed as a separate discipline, a separate set of technologies, process, and people to go do that. When in fact, it doesn't have to be, for all intents and purposes, it shouldn't be. So that's part of the accounts payable process, as is discount management. So as you're processing invoices and you're getting things ready for payment, you may have contracts with your suppliers that allow you to take an early pay discount. Contractually, it's called the traditional discount, like the 2%, 10, net 30, right? As long as I process within that 10-day window, I'm assured to get my discount. Typically, suppliers don't like that. That's why they're highly negotiated, and you only are touching a small percentage of your supplier base. But there's another dimension called dynamic discounting, which is a much more supplier-friendly model that says, hey, when you need cash, Mr. Supplier, let us know. And we're willing to take an early pay discount. You make the offer when and when you need to. And for suppliers, it's great. It's like a cheap loan, cheap source of cash, without having to go to my bank and whatnot. And I can still meet my capital needs or whatever the case I need to use it for. And that's a core function, because if I can take advantage of more early pay discounts, those are all savings that go right to the bottom line. And in case somebody stops and says, wait a minute, I don't have the cash to give every single discount that might come my way. Well, there's vehicles to control that. It's called cash pool management. You can set aside a set of cash for just taking advantage of early pay discounts, and once it's exhausted, you turn it off. But at least you're taking advantage of it. And based on the payments piece and on the, as we'll later talk about with the discounting piece, this is actually how I start to pivot from a cost center to a profit center. And also on top of this, and embedded within this environment, you need supplier enablement. So you need the engagement. You want to bring suppliers closer into the process, because when you do that, you create greater opportunities for even more efficiencies. So now suppliers can check the status of an invoice without having to call the AP department and bother them with asking, which is 98% of all questions, pretty much. But it's also, as they're making updates to their address and other information, again, they can do that in a self-service mode, or even enroll as a new supplier as well, or submit invoices electronically without creating the paper. Or this is a place where they raise their hand and say, I'm willing to take an early pay discount, right? So all those things, I would say that's an optimized approach to an AP automation platform. It's got the proper mix of the right scale and scope, but it's been brought together in such a way, it's a single unified application where you can simply turn on these capabilities versus bolting on some foreign element of technology and try to then have it all work together, which has typically been, pretty much the case in a lot of the marketplace from solutions. So you want that as a unified solution we call a single design center that affords you the opportunity to simply turn things on when you need it.
So, we all can
amazing.
We can all go along with that. But so explain to me why is that so much more of an efficient process than, as someone previously mentioned, Frankensteining a bunch of different solutions together?
Well, it's all about reducing complexity, right? When you start bolting on different types of technologies, you introduce a lot of complexity. It's now you're wedded to how integral and how seamless those interactions take place. If you have a single design center, it kind of evokes that I have this common user experience. I have a common method when turning things on. They all leverage off the other pieces. So, for example, if I have through my supplier enablement self-service portal, I have a supplier that says, hey, I'm willing to take an early pay discount on this particular invoice. that invoice gets tagged right away as a discountable invoice, and immediately gets promoted to the top of the invoice processing queue. Because the model there is the earlier the payment, the greater the discount. Why wouldn't I want to take advantage of that and do it quickly? So by having that seamless kind of interplay between these elements, that's how I'm able to get the maximum effect, both in terms of efficiency, cost savings, and later turning things into new sources of cash.
All right, before we move on here, one of the last things, because I'm a technical guy, I want to talk about
this is really cool. I love the way you guys got this set up. It's like the right brain and the left brain.
That's what works best for us.
Well, more of a critical thinker, more of a loud, obnoxious guy myself. There's some interplay there, but we'll talk about that later. Okay. But what I wanted to really do was talk about the security, the governance and compliance pieces. Now, I'm kind of putting all three of those pieces together, and I know there's very distinct disciplines between the three. But what I want to kind of look at is, okay, so your old model versus the new model, the old standard AP process for the process automation. I mean, you take a look at the existing process with a bunch of different people. I mean, there's innumerable security risks there. Each person is a security risk. You're talking about usernames and passwords. You're talking about people manually setting up. You're talking about a lack of insight. But could you go over a few additional pieces on how automating the AP and this digital transformation can actually help or improve all the security of the governance and compliance pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the underlying question is, am I better off? Right. And yes, technology can introduce some additional complexities, but the reality is, if you take a look at, they actually ultimately make things a lot easier. And like if we compare and contrast to the manual process, let's just look at that for a minute. To your points you just made, Patrick, virtually no control. People may get a handbook on the process and how to properly, process invoices and whatnot, but very quickly people find ways to circumvent that process, and because they
happens all the time.
Right, because they feel that they found a better way.
Yeah.
Right. But now I lost all that consistency, and Group A and this one department does it one way, and another group in a different region found that they do things much better in a different fashion. And to your point, Patrick, you create when things are done in an ad hoc fashion, relying on things like tribal knowledge and things of that nature, you create a tremendous, and again, I would say tremendous amount of security risk. And there is no governance, because you have what kind of visibility do you have in an environment like that?
Zero. No visibility at all.
So no transparency.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and then to go along with that, not only do you have no transparency, you mentioned tribal knowledge earlier. Mm-hmm. You're talking about all of these people doing separate things based on how they want to do. I mean, we all know we all have an employee handbook, and we have policies and procedures that we're supposed to adhere to.
We follow them to the T.
Right.
Yeah. Yes. We'll go with that. I'm using air quotes. We'll follow them to the T. But we're talking about a practical issue here. Is that no matter how good your policies and procedures are, they're only as efficient as the people. As they're followed, right? So the people follow the policies or procedures, or they don't.
Right.
And that, again, we're talking about inefficiency. We're talking about compliance issues there. And ultimately, if we have a single application or solution for this, that will help roll all of that into one.
Right. And I would also say, so think about the virtues of automation, what it provides, right? So if you have the right platform and approach, is that it, first of all, provides the structure that's needed. So that structure is what then leads to enforcing consistency. And when you have structure and consistency, now you start to create the element of control. And once you have the element of control and you have the structure and the consistency, now I have the means for visibility. So not only do I have the means to identify issues before they become problems, I have means to see, to make sure and enforce that the process is being followed. So there's the kind of the oversight piece, but there's also what's cool about automation is I can force it to happen and enforce it to happen.
Yeah.
Right. So
as much as you can.
As much as you can,
yeah.
But it's certainly a world better than it was back in that earlier scenario that we were talking about, right? And so you get your governance. This is how you get your true auditability. So governance equals, this is the auditability. So I can literally track everything that took place. I can see when an invoice first came in. I can see who touched it, where it was, where it's even now, where it's been, and where it's going. I can see who approved it. I can also see what changes were made. I can see what was the original value, what was changed, the new value, who approved it, and then how it had progressed through the rest of the process. So you have this really granular level of insight and control and auditability for your governance. And then security is I can prevent certain unsavory things from happening. So for example, if I'm routing an invoice through email, this is a cool area because people are like, wow, that's a really inexpensive way of mobilizing my operation. I have my mobile devices, I get my email on those devices. I should be able to then, if I get emails to be approved, for invoices to be approved, I can do it right from there. But you want the security, the encryption elements there that, first of all, make sure that who I'm sending it to is in fact you, Patrick, for example, or you, Mirage. And then if you try to, let's say, forward it to somebody else, you can't.
So you want each transaction with each one of your suppliers to be confidential because, that seems like it may give one an unfair advantage over the other. I'm just saying, in that scenario where Mirage says, hey, I want to get a little bit of a kickback, I'm going to go ahead and give the pricing and the information to the other supplier.
Or you could just have security and control. If you look at a multinational, global corporation that, you have different regions, different groups, you typically want to segregate what work they can see or what kind of performance statistics they can see. So when you have and this is inherent in this kind of platform approach, is that you should have the level of users and group control that gives you the flexibility, but also the control of basically based on the group and the role that I have, I will have access to certain functions and not others, right? And be able to see certain things and not others, for example. And it also allows you to have a nice fluid dynamic for processing and managing the operation at the same time. And again, in a global scale.
Well, there's an old adage, because you just talked about management, is that if it can't be measured, it can't be managed. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like this comprehensive solution that we're talking about would actually be able to allow us to manage the process more efficiently. Earlier, you talked about being proactive and dealing with certain different things. Like one of the examples that we'd go is like, okay, so you're an approver. We're trying to get this order approved, and let's just assume that I'm on vacation in Alaska, hunting, and I don't have access to my cell phone. Not that I'm being intentionally malicious here.
Right. Yeah.
So what you can do is you can set up a process or a control in there to say, okay, he's been there for 3 days. We're losing this potential discount. Let's go ahead and pull it out of his queue and put it in another approver's queue so that we can take advantage of that. And these human interactions don't actually stall out the process.
Right.
So what you're saying is being proactive, but we can also be reactive and establish rules to help us identify these funnels or these bottlenecks and actually improve the process both in functionality and speed overall.
Yeah, I would still classify it as being proactive because I'm able to detect, first of all, in advance that, hey, this thing still hasn't been approved yet. And if I'm going to make my SLAs, I know it has to be approved like right now. And again, you may be on vacation, but you maybe didn't fill out your out of office, notice, right? So nobody really, because only your immediate worker, your peer group knows where you're at. The rest of the organization obviously doesn't. So you want the ability to, not have to rely on things like that. So based on those, keeping those SLAs intact, you want to provide, hey, I've notified Patrick, several times now. I've gotten a response. I'm now going to escalate it immediately over to his manager.
Yeah, certain redundancies are appropriate.
Exactly, and you want to put those controls in place to protect against all those different contingencies and not having to rely on somebody turning on their out of office, for example. You want to. This is where you can hard code some things in there, or configure it, I should say, to have that flexibility, right? So that's just another example, right? And how you enforce the performance of the operation, especially when you're dealing with like early pay discounts. You want to take advantage of these things, right away. So you don't want something sitting, because as the time is ticking by, your discount is going down. That's, again, the model is early payment to earlier discount, which is why these kind of things make it really helpful.
Those are some great points. Speaking about the end-to-end cycle of of keys to success, basically. But there's one point you made in there that really intrigued me was profit center, evolving into a profit center. How do you get from to what's typically known as a cost center to something that's a profit center?
Right. So, like you said, in AP, since around the history, it's all been about efficiency, reducing costs, squeezing as much blood out of the stone, so to speak, as you possibly can. So every business process re-engineering effort is, okay, how can I get more automation? How can I get more cost savings and efficiencies? But really the next dimension here is there's an opportunity by employing things like payment automation as part of the AP process, as an integral component, as we talked about. This is where I start moving people from, let's say, check payments today and it's costing me anywhere from $5 to $7 per check, to electronic forms of payment that could be anywhere from no cost to just a few cents on the dollar. But that's still, in all respects, is still about cost savings and efficiencies, which is great. But what about if I could convince you to move to virtual card versus ACH? Now, if I bring you into a supplier using card or leverage that, and a lot of suppliers absolutely do, then I can take advantage of a cashback reward or rebate that goes right to me, the company, right? Now I've turned it into a new source of cash. That's cash on table. I wasn't, it's not about cost savings now. Now I have a new dimension here altogether. And that's just around payment automation. So the model of best practice is, as you're going through, especially onboarding new suppliers, you want to onboard them first with electronic forms of payment. You want to lead with a card versus ACH, because you have the opportunity to get those cashback rewards. Because if you go right to ACH, you just lost the opportunity, because in all of the experiences, once people go to ACH, they'll never go back and consider card usually. The other dimensions around how you turn this into a profit, this environment to a profit center, is through the early pay discounts, which we've been talking about as well. So, imagine if I can change the game by increasing the amount of suppliers that I can tap into who can potentially offer me an early pay discount versus this very constricted segment of my supplier.
What would you say that number is?
Well, if you look at the traditional contractual early pay discount arrangements that are made, you're only tapping into anywhere from 5 to at most 15 or 20% at most.
Wow.
Of your supplier base. So that obviously leaves up to more than or up to more than 80%. You'll never get all of it, but there's certainly much more to be had, obviously, and if you do the math. So the whole idea of early pay discount management or dynamic discounting is, how can I create a more supplier-friendly model that, when suppliers need cash, they can raise their hand and offer an early pay discount that I then can take advantage of. So how do I get more at bats? How do I get more offers, in essence, right? And that's exactly what these programs are designed to do. So now when I'm getting more early pay discounts, those go right to the bottom line. That could be as high as savings of 1% to 2% of total corporate spend. So you literally, it could be millions, if you will.
You're saving a lot there.
A ton.
Yeah.
And so that's, again, the pivot point of how you start moving AP from a cost center to a profit center. As you start employing payment automation, you ratchet up your early pay discount program. Some organizations don't even have that, but then, this is something they should definitely be thinking about, because this just adds more value to the operation. And the most innovative companies, the ones that are extremely well respected and are leading their peer groups, are ones that employ these types of capabilities around their AP operations. And this is also how they drive greater competitive advantage. Because if I'm generating cash for payments that I'm making,
that's a huge transformation.
Yes, exactly.
So we're talking about the potential here to increase efficiency,
right,
save money making early payments, and generating real revenue for the company based on making these payments in the proper place or time.
Mm-hmm. And doing it the same way you've been doing it, just different process or a more efficient process around it, and a technology that can handle that.
So basically it's helping us identify and take advantage of each one of these opportunities to hit it from all three ways, basically.
Yeah, that's exactly, and that's real transformation.
Yeah.
Right. If you're looking at transforming the organization, we just don't want to take the same process and do it 10 times faster and run into making mistakes 10 times faster. You really, this is a vehicle to transform AP, to reach its potential that it has in front of it. And that's actually what is a new dimension from what used to be in the past. What used to be in the past, to kind of bring it all together, is around all about cost and efficiency, which certainly is important today and absolutely should be looked at. But there's this another dimension now that really turns AP into a strategic force within the organization.
In my mind, I'm getting this thought of change management. How does that come into play around enabling this?
Yeah, so it definitely is not all about technology. With
Yeah.
any business digital transformation initiative, it's about people, process, and technology, right? And the change management elements are crucial here because, for example, in the payment automation side, there is an effort, and there are services actually and resources that actually help do this, is to help as you onboard suppliers, convince them to go, let's say, card or ACH, but at least some kind of electronic form of payment versus check, right? That's a change management element. It's new to the organization to be talking that way and try to encourage the suppliers to handle payments in that fashion versus just saying, well, I'm just going to get payments from the supplier, so fine, I'll write you a check. So how about we just do a card transaction? I'll do it ACH, right? So tremendous benefits, but that's a change management element. It's both for the organization and their dialogue with the suppliers and also the supplier themselves. The other facet is around change management is around dynamic discounting. So that is a much more intensive change management effort because, first of all, one of the major inhibitors or the reasons why things are challenging in that area, come to find out, is as simple as organizations not communicating to their suppliers that they have or a discount program or early pay discount program, or they're willing to accept early pay discounts, and explaining the process of what's the value and then how to do it, right? Because if you don't tell anybody about it, it's obviously not going to happen. But believe it or not, that's one of the
Is
first.
that common?
Yes, believe it or not. And if you talk to the good folks at Paystream Advisors or Ardent Partners, they'll tell you the same thing. That's it's the adoption piece. And when you get into things like adoption, it's change management. And then so interestingly too, kind of going along the same line of, or dynamic discounting, it's not just letting your partner community know that you're willing to accept early pay discounts. You need to market to them. You need to speak to the benefits. It's like running a marketing campaign. And that takes a different set of skills. Usually that is beyond what people in AP and finance are used to, right?
I mean, there's a joke, at least in the technical field, that most of us are ogres, that they keep us in the back office and they don't want us to interface with client. And if you find someone with soft skills that can actually communicate with people or go a little bit with the sales or marketing team, that they're a kind of diamond in the rough. And I haven't really had the fortunate opportunity to work with a lot of AP and finance people, but would you say that it's a similar way that a lot of AP and finance people, not that they don't have soft skills, but the sales and marketing piece or that communication piece just isn't what you would say where it needs to be to fully capitalize on those opportunities?
Yeah, they're obviously very skilled at the jobs they do, but the idea of marketing is a specialized skill set. So best to be handled by a group or an organization that knows how to engage suppliers much like you engage customers, and help convince them and that it's the benefits of participating in this early payment discount program, because it's obviously very good for the organization. It's also conveying how good it can be for the suppliers. And that's a marketing, that's a campaign.
Right.
And if you do it right, the benefits are tremendous and it happens. And that's how you help ensure success. But and again, it goes back to things that have been tried and true in any kind of transformational effort. You have to take into account the change management facet as well.
And you have to go in with a win-win approach.
Exactly.
Something that works for everyone involved.
Exactly.
As best as you can.
Exactly.
Yeah, so that was Chris. We're thankful to have you in studio. It's a pleasure to have you. That was some great insight. We talked about problems in AP automation, keys to success. We talked around security and the 4 points you mentioned around payments, dynamic discounting. And also what stood out most to me is evolving it into a profit center. That's pretty incredible.
I mean, the whole concept that you can directly impact revenue or generate revenue by doing something that used to cost money and be a mundane task, if you implement the proper strategy and solution, it's amazing. I mean, we'll get discounts, we'll affect the bottom line, we'll become more efficient, but generating revenue for the company based on a standard traditional process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was a great episode, and we got a lot of insight. Hopefully, everyone listening really got some good value from this. We look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of Transform IT. Thanks again, Chris, for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks again for having me. This was great.
This is Patrick Pauls.
And this is Murad Jawani.